All right, well, I think we'll get started, and I know some other folks will continue to arrive as we go along, but I'd like to welcome everyone on St. Patrick's Day to our next in our series of Journey to Yunque webinars, and we have Dr. Mike Willig from the University of Connecticut who will be presenting on where did the walking sticks go after Hurricane Hugo. Before he launches into the talk, and I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself, I wanted to do a little activity around Journey to Yunque. And so I'm going to share my screen. So if you can go to that link, there's actually a poll. And what it shows is 4 graphs showing possible responses to the walking sticks after Hurricane Hugo, where 0 represents the time just before the hurricane, and then the graph represents the 60 months after the hurricane. So the 4 responses are that the population of walking sticks went up after the hurricane and then went back to normal. The second one would be that it went down and then over time actually went above normal. The third option is that it goes down and then goes back to normal. Fourth option, it goes down and stays down. All right, so the 2 results that we got, I don't know if anybody else responded, chose the response of that it goes down and then it returns back to normal over time. So this is the Journey to Yunque program. And so I'm actually going to go in. There's a little activity that you can do to do a prediction. So the overall research question for the students is that organisms in El Yunque seem to be well adapted to hurricanes, but what will happen to the ecosystem if severe hurricanes strike the rainforest more frequently? And up here there's a series of modules that the students can go through to investigate that question. We're going to jump right into walking sticks. And for each of these modules, there's background readings on the walking sticks. Students can do a prediction and then do some modeling activities to try to understand what are the factors that affects the population of walking sticks after the hurricane. So I'm going to go ahead and then draw out the prediction that that folks picked, which is that it's going to go down and then kind of come back up to normal. And then once I've done the prediction, we have worksheets where students can then write a rationale for what their prediction was. I can click on test prediction and compare the actual data to what we predicted. So we were pretty close in that the population did go down after the hurricane, but it actually went at about 5 years or 4 years out, started to expand and actually went above normal. So with that, I will actually, let's see, stop sharing my screen. Did it stop sharing my screen? I'm going to throw the presentation mode over to Mike and allow him to introduce himself, and he'll be able to talk more detail about the data that we saw.
So can you see the screen now with the title slide on it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So, I have to switch screens here. 1 second. There. I think now you should see a single slide. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Ah, okay, well, thanks everyone for the opportunity to chat with you all. As Steve said, my name's Mike Willig. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut, and I've been working in Puerto Rico since about 1982 or 83, and have been there since the long-term ecological research project that Steve's a part of and that I'm a part of was funded by the National Science Foundation. So what I hope to do is to chat with you today about some of the patterns and processes that happen in response to cyclonic storms by looking at a number of keystone animal species for which we have reasonable data. So in overview, what I want to do today is sort of give you some feeling for the setting of the Luquillo Mountains, which is the site for the long-term ecological research that we conduct in Puerto Rico. To talk a little bit about the perspectives that one takes when looking at how organisms respond to disturbances, introduce you to the three focal or keystone animal species that I'll be talking about: bats, walking sticks, and snails, and then basically go through a similar exercise to the one that Steve just did, in that I will actually show you some long-term data about how hurricanes or cyclonic storms affect various attributes of these organisms and why that might be important for understanding sort of the nature of the ecological system that we work on. So the setting is obviously it is tropical in nature or subtropical, depending on whether you take a geographic focus rather than an ecological focus. And we're working on a forested ecosystem. This is actually a picture of the Luquillo experimental forest. And as you may or may not know, our work takes place in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a hotspot of biodiversity. We in particular work in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the smallest of the Greater Antilles. It stands sort of as a fulcrum between the Greater and the Lesser Antilles, and it has floral and faunal elements of both of those chains of islands. Puerto Rico itself, as you know, is an associated free state, part of the United States. It's about 90 miles long by 45 miles wide, so it's an island about the size of Connecticut, the state that I live in. But it's very diverse because it contains mountains that run along the main backbone of the island, and also here in the northeastern part of Puerto Rico, you'll find the Luquillo experimental forest in the Luquillo Mountains. And within the Luquillo Mountains are kind of interesting because they're the only tropical forest in the USDA Forest Service system, but probably more importantly, the Luquillo Mountains represent arguably the oldest nature reserve in the New World, because when the Spanish first occupied the island, it was a reserve for the King of Spain, and it has remained a reserve since it was so founded back in shortly after Columbus landed on the island. And so it's kind of an interesting system in that we have this nature reserve that's embedded in an area that's incredibly heavily populated. Puerto Rico represents one of the most densely populated tropical areas in the world. And within there we have this sort of emerald gem, the Luquillo experimental forest, which has been a site for long-term ecological research for many, many, many years. Now, one of the really cool, interesting things about the Luquillo experimental forest is it occurs about 10 miles from the coast. So as you go from essentially 0 meters above sea level to about 1,100 meters above sea level, we see dramatic changes in elevation, and that's accompanied by changes in precipitation and changes in temperature, because when air masses impinge on the mountain, they rise. When they rise, they cool, so the temperature gets cooler as you go up in elevation. And then also the cooling means that the clouds give up their moisture and it rains. So along elevational gradients, we often see increases in precipitation as we go up in elevation and decreases in temperature. And these changes in the environmental characteristics with elevation result in different forest types occurring in low elevations versus mid-elevation versus high elevation areas. And so at the lowest elevations, below 600 meters, we have Tabanuco forest. At intermediate elevations between 600 and 900 meters, we have Palo Colorado forest. And perhaps the coolest, or it's arguably the most interesting forest in some regards, is the elfin forest that occurs above 900 meters. It contains trees that are short in stature, gnarled, covered with lichens and bryophytes. The actual soil is covered with roots, so it's a root mat covering the surface of the soil. And it's often shrouded in fog and mist. So it's a really quite different habitat than the rest of the island's habitats. And it exists as sort of islands within an island because it only occurs on the very highest elevations of mountaintops. So elfin forest is a very interesting forest. But most of the work that we do in the Luquillo experimental forest is actually in Tabanuco forest. And that's essentially I'm going to restrict my attention to research on animals in Tabanuco forest, the best study of the sites that are present. And if I haven't told you already, please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you can do that, or maybe send a text message or a chat message, I guess, and I can immediately respond, or we can save those messages to answer them later. And I think, in fact, I don't know if Steve can talk at the same time as me, but I think the idea was if you don't want to interrupt and ask the question, but want to post the question so that we don't forget it, the chat window is a good opportunity to do that. So the Tabanuco forest is a subtropical wet forest. It receives about 3.5 meters of rain a year, so it's very wet. The dominant tree species is called Dacryotes excelsa. Its common name is Tabanuco, so obviously the forest gets its name from the dominant tree species. And it is not an aseasonal forest like lots of the tropics are. Rather, it's a somewhat seasonal forest in that there's a wet season from May to December and a dry or a less wet season from January to April. And it's not so much that the total amount of precipitation varies, but you can have more frequent periods of 2 to 3 day duration where there'll be no rain in the dry season, whereas that's much less common in the wet season. And temperatures are relatively constant year-round. So it's a great place to work. It has a lot of the allure of the Amazon without a lot of the difficulties of having to travel so far to get there. So it's understanding the Tabanuco forest is a way of trying to understand all tropical forests to the extent that any one forest can represent any other forest. The Luquillo experimental forest, as I say, contains Tabanuco forest, and there's a grid established by the LTR there called the Luquillo Forest Dynamics Plot, the LFDP. We call it the big grid. And the graphic to the left on your screen represents sort of topographic relief. As we go to the north, the elevation decreases. As we go to the east, elevation increases. The research that we do there is on this 16-hectare grid. It contains a rectilinear suite of rows and columns, so to speak. And at various sites within this grid, we have 3-meter plots. The 3-meter plots represented by the large circles, like this one, or this one, or this one. As I said, have 60-meter spacing between them, and there's 40 of those large circles. We've been going to those sites for 15 or 20 years at this point in time, and those are the sites at which we extensively study the walking sticks and the snails. And in a few of the years, we've also sampled a lot of other plots in addition to the 40 points, and those are the smaller circles that you see there. Another thing that's really interesting about the Luquillo Forest and the Luquillo Forest Dynamics plot in particular is that when we first got there, it was actually chosen to be kind of a representative or a model site that characterized Tabanuco Forest. And after we got there and started to work and learn more about the trees and the fauna and the nutrients in the soil, it became pretty obvious that there were sections of this big grid that were different than other sections. And so we went back and looked at the sort of looked at photos from when the Forest Service first acquired the land, and it became clear that some of these areas had been logged and others had not been. So up here to the right, the red areas represent a zone that had light selective logging in the past. The intermediate or yellow area here contained intensive logging and agriculture in the past, and the blue areas to the lower left part of your grid contain shade coffee and small-scale agriculture. So even though we thought the forest was relatively undisturbed by human activities, in fact, all areas of that forest had been subjected to more or less disturbance by humans in association with agriculture and forestry. And in fact, based on the plants that occur in the Luquillo experiment and on the big grid, and even soil bacteria. You can still see the consequences of those agricultural practices from 40 years ago. So although we can't see the agricultural practices, 40 years later we can see their impact. And so that's sometimes called a legacy. You can't see the agricultural practice, but you can see the impact of it some time later. And so the other nice thing about the Luquillo Forest Dynamics plot is it's not only extensive and covers these 16 hectares, but it also comprises these 3 different human disturbed areas as well, and they represent neat experimental zones for doing research. I won't be focusing on those so much in my presentation today because it's only about 30 minutes in length, but if you have some questions about it, we can talk about that as well. So before going any further, I thought it would be kind of interesting. You know, ecologists study the forest to try to understand how plants, animals, and microbes interact with each other. They take up energy and pass it on through food webs or food chains, and they cycle nutrients, and they create ecosystems. So in a sense, what we're trying to understand is how the biota, how plants, animals, and microbes interact with matter and energy and create systems. And those systems at the level that we're focusing on are ecosystems. And these ecosystems, as we've already intimated, have historically, over evolutionary time, actually been subjected to hurricanes for a long, long, long time. And we're trying, at the Luquillo Experimental Forest, we're trying to understand the impacts of these hurricanes on the nature of our ecosystem. And it's kind of cool. If you go back in time, the native Indians that inhabited Puerto Rico, the Taínos, had a legend. And so what you have before you now is sort of a summary of the legend that I take from Muckley and Martinez Santiago. And like most legends about creation, it begins in the beginning. Here in the beginning, Atabey created the heavens and the earth, and Atabey had always existed. She was the original mother, but she had 2 sons, Yucayu and Huaycar. Yucayu created the sun and the moon to illuminate the earth, and the earth, as a consequence, was fertile and grew plants and trees. And in seeing the plants and trees, Yucayu then created animals and birds to enjoy them as well. But his brother, at least in the legend, Huaycar, looked with envy at all that his brother had created, and he began to taint the creations of his brother. In other words, he was jealous. And he changed his name as a consequence, and he became the terrible god of evil that in Taíno legends was Huracan. And Huracan carried the winds, and sometimes he carried them with such force that they destroyed what Yucayu had created. Huracan uprooted trees and killed animals and made life difficult for the humans that lived there. But what's interesting about this legend that the Taíno Indians had is it was a really naturalistic kind. They recognized the role of hurricanes as a destroyer, as a motivation of change in the mountains, and they saw the mountain as something that did 2 things. It provided them with sustenance, but it also buffered them from the effects of Huracan. And so I think it's kind of neat that, in fact, the word we use to describe cyclonic storms in the New World is derived from the Taíno word Huracan, and the Luquillo Mountains, in fact, is a kind of Spanish variant of the name Luquillo. So I think it's cool that the Taínos sort of captured the essence of what it is we're trying to understand. How does the biota respond to hurricanes, and how does the mountain bring life back once the hurricane has hit? So this graphic gives you a really good feel for the fact that the Caribbean, in addition to the eastern coast of the United States and part of the Yucatan Peninsula, are subject to frequent hurricanes and tropical storms. So if you look at this NOAA graphic, the yellow lines represent Category 3 and 4 cyclonic storms, hurricanes. They have winds greater than 110 miles per hour, and the red lines represent the paths of tropical storms, and they're between 75 and 110 miles per hour. So what you can see is that in addition to the Caribbean being a hotspot of biodiversity, as I intimated earlier, it's also a hotspot for hurricane activities. And some predictions based upon climate change scenarios suggest that the frequency of the hurricanes in the Caribbean may increase in the near term, in the next 50 to 100 years, or if the number of hurricanes doesn't increase, at least the number of very intense hurricanes is likely to increase. And so extreme events are going to become more and more probable in this area. So our research studying hurricanes is timely because perhaps it gives us a window into what the future might look like when the frequency and intensity of hurricanes is changing as a consequence of global climate change. And this graphic is another NOAA illustration to show you that the path of Hurricane Georges, which happened in 1998, went right along the major Greater Antilles, was a direct hit on Puerto Rico, and it gives you a feel for how the impact of the storms may influence the biota that we're looking at. Of course, it's not just the biota, not just the Caribbean. You know, I live in Connecticut. We were hit pretty hard by Hurricane Sandy. Everyone knows about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And so it's not only of interest because, for those of us that study nature, it's interest to humans and their very livelihoods to try to understand what it is that hurricanes do and to not do. So before getting too much further into the talk, I wanted to define some terms to represent context for understanding what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And one is I've already used the word disturbance, but I haven't defined it. And I'm not going to try to be too rigid about the definition because there's actually some argument is about, or at least there's not 100% agreement about what the definition is. But for the purpose of this presentation and most things you'll read, a disturbance is a discrete event in time. It might last a couple hours, a couple days, a couple weeks, but it's a discrete event in time that alters the distribution of biomass, living material, or necromass, dead material. So the idea is that disturbances mix things up. They redistribute living and dead material on the surface of the earth. And as a consequence of that, they may change the abundance and distribution of organisms and how they interact with each other. So disturbances can play a really important role in affecting what it is we see in nature. But just hurricanes, for example, are just one kind of disturbance. There are actually multiple kinds of disturbances, and that calls to question not just that we want to study each single disturbance, but we want to understand disturbances in the context of the multiple disturbances that may occur in an area. So, for example, in addition to hurricanes, you know, fires are disturbances that can occur naturally, starting when things are dry and there's electrical discharge from storms. Tornadoes are disturbances, floods are disturbances. They're all relatively discrete, and they redistribute dead and living matter on the surface of the area that they hit. And any one area, let's say the Luquillo experimental forest, may be affected by multiple disturbance types. So there are hurricanes that hit in Puerto Rico, there are tropical storms that hit in Puerto Rico, there are droughts, there can be floods. We already mentioned that human activities can act as disturbances when people log a forest or they cut down a forest and plant agricultural crops. When you go out and mow your lawn, that's a disturbance because you're changing the distribution of living and dead material in your backyard. So when we talk about a disturbance regime, we're focusing on the fact that any one area is subject to multiple kinds of disturbances. Each of those disturbance types, hurricanes, floods, fires, have a frequency of occurrence so many per year. So prior to, let's say, 1989, the hurricane frequency was maybe one every 30 to 50 years. Things like a tree fall, which is another kind of disturbance, may be once every year, once every 2 years, or a landslide might be once every 5 years. So each disturbance type has a frequency, how often it occurs over a particular unit of time. And in addition, it has an intensity. And intensity is a measurement technically of how much energy is associated with the particular event. So hurricanes, or I should say storms that have high intensity winds are called hurricanes. Those storms that have lower speed winds are called tropical storms. And so intensity can also be measured in the amount of rainfall associated potentially with a disturbance, or even the amount of coastal flooding or storm surge that's caused when a hurricane comes through. So the intensity may reflect wind speed, water or precipitation that's put onto the earth, or storm surge associated with it. And then the extent has to deal with the spatial area that's affected by the disturbances. So although tornadoes are incredibly intense, they have pretty small footprints. They hit relatively small areas. They have just a footprint that follows the very bottom part of the tornado. So highly intense, but relatively low in extent. And then severity is a term that we use to talk about how bad are the consequences. How did the focal characteristics of interest respond, whether that's the abundance of an organism or the diversity of birds or the structure of the forest, or how did the bridges fare in response to these activities. So to really understand sort of the long-term dynamics of plants and animals in the forest or ecosystem processes, we really need to look at the entire disturbance regime and look how the suite of different disturbance types vary in frequency, intensity, and extent, and how, as a consequence of that, the fauna, the flora, the ecosystem processes are impacted by any particular disturbance events. So we characterize disturbances by these attributes that I just mentioned: frequency, intensity, extent, and severity. The responses to disturbances are often parlayed into two terms: resistance and resilience. Resilience has become a really popular word in the press nowadays. They're always talking about adapting areas to become resilient to disturbance or hurricanes or floods or fires. But each of these terms in ecology have very specific meaning. And resistance is kind of like inertia. It's the extent to which the system that you're looking at does not change in light of a disturbance. Whereas resilience measures the speed with which it returns to what it was before. And we'll talk about how populations and behaviors of these keystone taxa exhibit resistance or resilience to various hurricane events in Puerto Rico. So a very quick look, if you're focusing on the structure of the forest, you'll see that when Hurricane Hugo hit Puerto Rico in 1989, it basically defoliated large areas of the forest. It uprooted tons of trees. It broke many, many branches. And it looked like a forest fire had hit it about 2 months ago, when in fact all of this damage you're seeing is a consequence of a cyclonic storm that took about 3 or 4 hours to hit the Luquillo experimental forest. The picture you see, I'm sorry, I have two screens up, so I was actually moving the cursor over the wrong screen. So this shows the devastation from the hurricane, whereas this shows what that exact same spot looked like 5 years later. So the biota respond to these disturbances, and plants and animals die and grow and move, and very quickly the area became green again. You started to see a canopy forming, and the amount of production or carbon that's being fixed is increased. So this dynamic process that happens, you have a disturbance, and then you have the biota changing over time in response to that disturbance, is called succession, ecological succession. When ecological succession happens, when they're such as this, it's called secondary succession, because there was a whole suite of plants and animals and seeds and propagules already in the area, and they could just migrate in situ and grow. So this is secondary succession. Whereas primary succession happens, for example, after a volcano erupts and totally covers an island with lava. Then there's actually no living organisms there, and all the organisms have to be blown in or swim in or float in. And so that's called primary succession, or after an area has been deglaciated when the glaciers retreat, and then the biota reforms, that's called primary succession. So really what we're studying in Puerto Rico is the immediate effects of disturbances like hurricanes, and then how, left to their own devices, the plants and animals respond to that disturbance, undergo secondary succession, and change. And it's this dynamic process of change that's important to us as ecologists, and the attributes of change that can be quantified as resistance and resilience are the things that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the talk. So that's a little bit about the setting. Now I want to talk a little bit about the actors. I already intimated that they would be walking sticks, snails, and bats. You might wonder why those three groups of organisms. The fact of the matter is they all come out at night. I studied nocturnal organism. I went to Puerto Rico the very first time to study bats, and unlike the Amazon or parts of Brazil where I had worked before, bats are not as common or abundant, but walking sticks and snails are hyper abundant, and so it became obvious that you could do lots of cool things with walking sticks and snails because of their abundance that you can't do with bats. So I've been studying all three of those taxa since I got to Puerto Rico. And there's some references at the bottom associated with each of the three groups of actors that tell you, that will give you some basic information about each of these taxonomic groups as well as their responses to disturbance. And there's a ton of papers on my website as well that relate to how walking sticks, snails, or bats respond to disturbances in Puerto Rico. Walking sticks are nocturnal, as I already mentioned. They're pretty abundant. They're folivores. In other words, they're herbivores. They're consumers of plants that eat leaves. They can be particularly important in forests such as Puerto Rico because they are particularly abundant in light gaps created by tree falls or hurricanes, and they can be voracious consumers of early successional plants. And when they eat those plants, they then process them through their digestive tract, they defecate, and they enhance the rate at which nutrients are recycled and not tied up in the biomass of these early successional plants. So they may facilitate subsequent plant growth in the area. So walking sticks are interesting from that regard. Gastropods or snails, in contrast, are basically grazers. They consume algae or microorganisms that live on the surface of leaves. They consume bacteria and fungi as well. And some of them are actually scavengers. They'll eat other gastropods. And they're also capable of consuming already dead plant materials. So they're scavengers. Bats is obviously they're mammals. They're flying mammals, so they're much more mobile in the forest. The species that we'll talk about are all generally herbivores. They eat plant material. Some of them are frugivorous. They eat fruits, and they're important because they disseminate seeds, and so they affect the abundance and distribution of plants. And others are nectarivores. That means they eat nectar and pollen, and they're important because they basically ensure the reproductive success of the plants, because when they go to eat the nectar, they inadvertently pollinate the plants that they visit, and so that they're able to ensure the long-term succession, so to speak, of plant species. So for different reasons, walking sticks, snails, and bats are keystone species because they sort of disproportionately play a really important role in the Keogh experimental forest. All of them are out at night. The walking sticks and snails we study by doing nocturnal surveys, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, just visual surveys. The bats we work with at night as well, and we erect mist nets that kind of look like badminton nets, and the bats fly into those nets and you capture them, much like the shuttlecock that you do in badminton, and you take them out, identify them, and release them. So finally, the plot. So the plot is what's the impact of disturbances and what does succession look like after disturbance. And the Puerto Rico site is particularly important because it provides us with a long-term view. And I think this is really important because most ecological research does not take a long-term view. And it's mostly because of funding limitations and the shortness of human lives, for that matter. But I like to use an analogy between what ecologists do and what we do when we go to the movies. So ecologists are just like movie aficionados. We're observing nature. And of course, any good moviegoer tries to get there at the beginning of the movie and watch it religiously for the 2 hours that it's on. And at the end, they have a pretty good chance of understanding who the protagonist and antagonist was, who the main and the supporting characters were, what the plot was, how the different actors interacted with each other. And they kind of, at the end of the movie, you have this feeling of, there's a little French term, I always loved this when I was in college, it goes denouement, the unraveling, so that we understand how all this stuff that we've just looked at comes to result in the relationship that we see at the very end. So it gives meaning to everything we've seen. In other words, it defines the story for us. So moviegoers watch pretty much every frame of the movie, and they watch it continuously, and as a consequence of having watched it, they pretty much know what the movie was about, and they can communicate that understanding to other people as a consequence to their continuous study of the movie. In contrast, ecologists don't want to go and watch a 2-hour movie. Well, they might, but that's not what they get paid for. Rather, they want to understand the dynamics of these living ecosystems and the organisms that occupy them. And rather than having it as a 2-hour movie, it's really more like a movie that takes a century or at least scores of years for all the interactions to unravel and to take place. So the next slide suggests that the shortcomings of ecology often are that rather than study the movie frames continuously for 2 hours, we only look at 1 or 2 snapshots in time. And from those 1 or 2 snapshots, what we did in 1989 or what we did in 2004 or what we did during the wet season of 2007, we try to extrapolate from that some broad understanding of the whole movie, how the ecosystem works. And even worse, most of us don't even study the entire frame. We're focused on one of the characters, the bats, or the gastropods, or the plants, or the fungi, or nitrogen cycle, or phosphorus cycle. And so not only are we limited in terms of the number of frames of the movie we watch, we're often very narrowly focused on only one of the actors or a small part of the movie. So long-term ecological research attempts to address this question by facilitating the ability of ecologists, botanists, zoologists, microbial biologists, people that study biogeochemistry cycles, geologists, atmospheric scientists. In other words, all the elements of each frame of the movie to be studied in concert and over the long term in hopes that we'll have a better understanding of how the system works so that we can sort of wisely be good stewards of that land. And then also, if we want to maintain the ecosystem services that habitat or that ecosystem provides, we will be able to manage it more wisely as well. So we're really fortunate, all of us that are associated with a long-term ecological research site, to be able to sort of watch the whole movie and to benefit from the interactions of all the players rather than just have a single snapshot of a single taxon or a single actor over time. So this is the movie that I'm going to be talking about. It's going to go from about 1989 to 2009, about a 20-year period. During that 20-year period, there were a bunch of disturbance events. Some of them were hurricanes or tropical storms like Hugo or Georges, which were the most severe storms during those times. But there was also Hurricane Luis in Maryland, Hurricane Bertha and Hortense, and Hurricane Kyle, which were lesser storms that hit the Luquillo experimental forest, and a number of droughts as well that are indicated in gray. So all this is trying to show you is that, at least in terms of hurricanes and droughts, there were multiple disturbances to hit the Luquillo experimental forest, to impinge on the Luquillo forest dynamics plot. And although we focus on Hurricane Hugo or Hurricane Georges, and we make our prediction, what happens after Hugo, we say what happens after Hugo, but without knowledge about the first drought in around 1991, or the second drought in 1994, or a minor hurricane in 1995, it's hard to understand what you would expect populations to do along this time. So really you have to sort of study the entire disturbance regime to understand the full trajectory of response of organisms. Hurricane Hugo was a Category 4 storm. It had maximum wind speeds that were sustained of about 227 kilometers per hour. It created tons of canopy openings in the forest. It created lots of debris. It totally defoliated the forest. 9 years later, Hurricane Georges impacted the Luquillo forest dynamics plot. It was a less intense storm, or storm as it says here. Its wind speeds were about 177 kilometers per hour. And since it hit the forest only 9 years after Hurricane Hugo, it didn't create so many openings. It didn't deposit so much debris. And it did very minor defoliation of the forest. So Georges was a much less severe hurricane than was Hugo, in part because its climatic or meteorological characteristics were less than they were for Hugo, but also because the forest that Hurricane Georges impacted was structurally much different than the forest that was present before Hurricane Hugo. So some of you that may have attended the previous webinar by Jess Zimmerman or have participated in Journey del Yunque know that there's some standardized disturbance response trajectories that we talked about, and in a sense you guys were kind of trying to evaluate alternative trajectories. So let's pretend that this solid dot is a disturbance event. The dashed line is our indication of what background looked like. The gray area might represent the variation that you might expect in that background condition. In any case, the disturbance event happens, and then we have these four trajectories, A, B, C, and D. And what you can see is at least whatever A is measuring, whatever system characteristic A is measuring, it really didn't change within the bounds of normal. So we couldn't really distinguish A as a disturbance response versus what we would generally expect as just year-to-year variation or site-to-site variation within a location. Whereas trajectories B, C, and D took you way outside the normal range of activities, and we would consider those to have been true responses to the disturbance. But of course, B returned very quickly to background condition, C a little less quickly, but nonetheless returned to background conditions, and D failed to return. So we would say that A was very resistant to the hurricane because it didn't change much. In fact, it changed so little, it was within the bounds of normal. B, C, and D's initial responses were identical. They were not very resistant at all to hurricane disturbance, but notice that B returned very quickly to normal. It was highly resilient. C showed intermediate resilience. It came back pretty quick, but not quite as quickly as B. And D showed absolutely no resilience. In fact, it didn't return to anything close to the previous state. It returned to an altered state. And so we'd like to be able to distinguish sort of conditions that differ in resistance, resilience, and these altered states, and how particular kinds of hurricanes or disturbances elicit these kinds of responses. So one final graphic, and then we'll get on to the actual details of what's happening in the biota. Again, if we for a moment try to contrast resistance and resilience, we could just let the X and Y axis represent two different characteristics that might be of interest to you. It could be the X axis could be nitrogen concentration, the Y axis could be phosphorus concentration. And so sometime here we have, this was the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus. A disturbance event happened. It changed the phosphorus. It didn't change the nitrogen. But this change in state is a measurement of resistance. It changed a little bit. In contrast, in situation B, they started out exactly the same point as in A, but the system changed a lot more. So in graphic A, there's high resistance. In graphic B, there's low resistance. So lots of change means no resistance. Little change means high resistance. C, D, and E are graphics that try to capture the concept of resilience. And so notice that in D, C, and E, in all three of the lower graphics, the original displacement in an ecological space or an environmental space or in space defined by nitrogen and phosphorus were identical. Delta E2 in C, D, and E are identical. So those situations have identical resistance. But the pathways that happened during secondary succession were different in all three of the cases. Notice in case C, it took 3 time steps to get back to the original condition. In D, it took 4 time steps. So C and D did exhibit resilience, but C was more resilient than D because it got back more quickly to the original state. Notice in E, it also took 4 time units to get back to the original condition. But notice that the trajectory in D is quite different than the trajectory in E. And so people are coming to recognize that the time steps are not only important, but what the system looks like as it goes through secondary succession. And so resistance and resilience are two characteristics of biotic responses to tropical storms that are important for understanding Little Q mountains. So now the walking sticks. So this is a very complicated graph in some senses, but I'm going to walk you through it and hopefully it'll become clear. So first we're going to focus on the lower 2 panels. And that's where we're focusing on the number of walking sticks. Lamponius portuensis is the scientific name of the walking stick. The y-axis is its abundance, the number of individuals per hectare. The x-axis is time periods in seasons, where the odd numbers represent the dry season, the even numbers represent the wet season. So every change of 2 represents a change of a year. So there's about 9 years represented in this graphic, and about 9 years represented in this graphic. This graphic is showing what happens after Hurricane Hugo. This graphic is showing what happens after Hurricane Georges, both of which impinged on the Licue Forest Dynamics plot. Now, unfortunately, we didn't really have any pre-disturbance data for the Licue Forest Dynamics plot. It was established after Hurricane Hugo. But fortunately, we had other grids in Beasley, which is another watershed in Tabanuco Forest, about a 20-minute drive from the Licue Forest Dynamics plot. And we had done a study of walking sticks at Beasley. So before the hurricane, we had almost 400 individuals per hectare, plus or minus about 100 individuals. And so we consider that as a measurement of pre-hurricane abundance. Anything in this gray area represents pre-hurricane abundance, to the best of our knowledge. Hurricane Hugo corresponds to this downward pointing arrow at time 0, and subsequent time periods represent secondary succession. At Beasley, 1 year after Hurricane Hugo, there was maybe only 20 or 30 walking sticks per hectare, a massive decrease in walking stick abundance. So walking sticks were incredibly not resistant to hurricanes. They showed massive declines in abundance. So we know that the immediate impact of the hurricane was quite severe, at least at Beasley. And if we use it as a model for what it would have looked like in the Licue Forest Dynamics plot, we can use that as a measurement of background information, the normal condition, if you will. So subsequently, all the data from time period 3 onward represents data from the Licue Forest Dynamics plot. And what you'll notice is at time 3, time 4, time 5, there's essentially 0 walking sticks. Not only were there essentially zero walking sticks in the Licue Forest Dynamics plot, all through the forest you could barely see walking sticks. I've done tons of studies of walking sticks in Puerto Rico. I could go out in a night and catch 20 adult walking sticks in a couple hours. Well, it would take me months and months and months to see even 5 or 6 walking sticks after Hurricane Hugo. So it clearly showed that there was considerable lack of resistance. But so the immediate effect was severe. The short-term effects over a 2-year period, things were still looking pretty bad for the walking sticks. They hadn't recovered. But the longer-term effects, years 3 and onward, suggest that although there was some variation in the population, it was more or less, on average, getting back to something within the same range as what we had in the Licue experimental forest prior to Hurricane Hugo. Immediately thereafter, Hurricane Georges came, indicated by the downward pointing arrow in the next graphic. And now you can see that it really didn't have much of an impact. So if you go from pre-Georges to post-Georges, walking sticks weren't affected very much, and they stayed at these low levels forever, only rarely getting anywhere close to what the pre-Hugo density was like. So here we have low resistance, but reasonable resilience. Here we have no resistance. I should say, here we have little resilience, but a fair amount of resistance. So the fauna responds to hurricanes in different ways, and these trajectories that we see of mean abundance and their variation reflect that. And the data on top represent measurements of the abundance of one of their preferred foods, Piper trolliaceatum and Piper hispidum. And you can see that there's also variation in the abundance of these foods. And to make a long story short, the variation in the abundances that we see in the lower graphs are correlated with the abundances that you see in the upper graphs, but there's a 3 to 4 year lag period, partly because it takes 3 to 4 years to to change the biomass that you consume in your food to grow into adulthood, to lay eggs, and have your eggs grow into adult walking sticks that you'll see later.
So, Mike, can you hear
Yes?
me? I
Yes.
just wanted to point out that we're almost at 7:30.
Okay. So, what I will do then is I at least cover the walking, but let me go quickly to a couple slides. I'll skip the gastropods and go to the bats, because I'll go to this slide, and because what I've talked about so far are sort of demographic responses in population abundance, but animal behavior changes as well. So when we were studying bats, in particular Stenoderma rufum, which is the red fig-eating bat, and it's endemic to Puerto Rico, we were interested in its home range. And a home range is the size of an area that an organism traverses in its day-to-day activities. And we measured the home range of bats based upon radiotelemetry. We put little telemeters on their backs and detected them with Yagi antennas, and we were able to determine their geographic locations on the grid. And then based upon capturing them over and over again, maybe 100 or a couple hundred times, we're able to create these use diagrams that show us something about the area of the big grid that they occupied and the intensity with which they used it. And the area at the base of these diagrams represent their home range. And so this example shows you here an organism had a home range that was modest in size, lots of activity concentrated in the center of that home range. Right after the hurricane, the home range became much larger, activity was low everywhere, and then about 2 years later, it began to look like it did before. And you can see that in terms of the home range and the foraging range of these species. Before Hurricane Hugo, home ranges were about 2,000 square meters. After Hurricane Hugo, they increased amazingly, almost tenfold. So organisms had to spend a lot more of their time traveling to find roosts, traveling to try to find food. It was energetically very expensive to live in the Loquillo experimental forest. And in fact, that's partly why we think Stenoderman's abundance went down after the hurricane, why we didn't see any reproduction in them for a few years. And then 2 to 3 years after the hurricane, we see that home range sizes are getting back to being almost what they were before the hurricane, much smaller, much energetically expensive. So what I've covered today were basically some very basic things of disturbance regimes, secondary succession, resistance and resilience in tropical systems, and then some behavioral responses that relate to home range size. And so with that, I'll say thank you. And sorry that I went over.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Mike. I think that was very interesting. And I know we're right at 7:30, and I know some people might need to leave, but we can certainly stick around if anyone would like to ask Mike a question, or if you'd like to have him talk a little bit more about snails, we can do that. So you can unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can type a question into the chat window. Although, Mike, we did have a question earlier that came up in the chat window about what does it mean to have a drought in a rainforest versus what people would think of as a drought, say, in California, where you have water rationing.
Right. So I guess the first thing is, droughts are usually defined in terms of agriculture. So when they talk about drought, it's usually a certain number of consecutive days with either no rain or some minimum amount of rain. And people and so when you have, let's say, 1 day of no rain, that's not a drought. 2 days of rain, that's no drought. But 20 days of rain for a corn crop is a drought. In a tropical forest, it's almost constantly engulfed in water. And so in a forest, though, it's amazing how, and you've seen this probably, Steve, is that after 3 or 4 days, the leaf litter dries up if there's been no rain. After 5 or 6 days, you might see that a lot of the fungi are dying in the forest floor, and the gastropods, the snails that live in the leaf litter, are expending a lot of energy looking for food and trying to survive because they need that moisture. So a drought should really be defined in the eyes of the beholder, where the beholder is the organism of importance. So, you know, a drought to a camel is different than a drought to a bacterium. But what's really clear is that these droughts can have really big impacts, especially on the microorganisms. And then the microorganisms, or the smaller organisms, can have cascading effects on the other levels in the food chain or the food web.
All right, thank you.